Her name was Jochebed, and she was a Hebrew slave in Egypt. And when she realized that the life of her baby boy was threatened, she did something incredible. You remember the story from when you were in Sunday school when you were little? She put baby Moses in a basket made of reeds and sent him down the river at a certain time in a certain place so that he would be found by the daughter of Pharaoh. And then what happened? Instead of his life being threatened, his life was not only saved, but he lived to eventually save his people. All because of the faith of that Hebrew slave who we know next to nothing about except that she had a vision of faith. I think she had a deep impact on Moses because he did grow up, but was clearly still in the process of his faith. One day when he was a young man, he was overcome watching an Egyptian taskmaster beat a Hebrew slave, and he killed that man. Now, what he thought was going to happen was some kind of uprising of the people. But not only did his adoptive family turn on him, read the story carefully, the Hebrew people turned on him too. And he got the worst of all punishments. Is the worst punishment death? It really isn't. The worst of all punishments is being exiled, cut off from everything that you know, everyone that you know. And in this instance, he's exiled into the desert. I want you to try to get in his head a little bit here. How horrible would that be? How easy would it be to quit or to live the rest of your life angry at God? I used to tell my students, no matter what happens to you, somebody's had it worse and has used it for motivation to succeed instead of an excuse to fail. And so we get to see why God gives us so much information about the life of Moses in the Bible. His story is fascinating. And what we see over and over again is Moses using terrible circumstances for a new set of possibilities with God. So Moses goes from living a life of luxury in the palace in Egypt to being a shepherd. Can God use circumstances like that? What was happening in the life of Moses during these years was two things. One was that he was learning what this land looked like. That would become critical later on. And the other is that he was learning to be open to what God might do with any circumstances. The Bible uses a phrase that sounds so simple: waiting upon the Lord. That sounds so simple until you're the one waiting and waiting and waiting. Years later, Moses is going through the desert and something catches his attention that anybody else might have just glanced at. He sees a burning bush. Couldn't have been something never seen in the desert. People use fire. But he comes across this burning bush and realized that it was not being consumed. And then those years of being open to what God may do, being open to what God may say, paid off. And I believe he not only saw what others may not have seen, I believe he heard what others would not have heard. He heard the voice of God. Moses, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. All those years before, when a young Moses had wanted nothing more than to save his people, he suddenly finds himself out in the middle of nowhere. Now he is out in the middle of the desert, hearing God tell him that he will now have the opportunity to partner with him to do his work. Realize the ingredients here. Moses could have used his past as an excuse to fail. Instead, he used everything that happened as motivation. He was now able to do, with the power of the Almighty, what he was unable to do years before by himself. And with God's help, he set his people free. Now, when you read the Bible as a whole, instead of breaking it down in little pieces all the time like we have a tendency to do, when you read the Bible as a whole and look at the lives of the ones we get to have a lot of information about, this is what you see. Real stories, not mythical heroes in some story, Real life, real people tapping into something bigger than themselves that they could not do on their own. I had a professor that used the analogy of sailing. If you know how to work a sailboat, you have an incredible skill. Anybody can sail with the wind at their backs. But if you know how to work a sailboat, you've learned how to sail into the wind. How does that work? It almost seems impossible for those of us who have never done it. But by learning how to use a rudder and a sail and this term called tacking, you can use a wind blowing at you to propel yourself and your boat into it. One of the people in the Bible who was able to do this in life was Paul. It's important to remember this man was formerly named Saul. Saul was a fundamentalist Pharisee of the worst sort, someone who was literally willing to kill to enforce his religion. Then he had an encounter with the living Christ and partnered with God to do his work. What happens in the years that followed would be funny if it weren't true. The guy proceeds to get beat up and thrown in jail in every town he goes to. You know, there's always been this speculation of what the thorn in his side was. I think it was getting the same kind of beatings that he used to give to other people in every town that he went to, over and over and over again. Then he would end up in jail and do what? Write letters. The letters that ended up being the majority of what we now call the New Testament. Think about that. There is nothing new about being thrown in jail and having your freedom taken away from you. Feeling like whatever you were trying to do has at least been put on hold or at most defeated. Instead, quietly reflecting on God, listening to the still small voice, and using what everyone else would consider life just beating you down over and over again, and instead being open to how God might still use you. It's like tacking into the wind, using what anyone else would consider just life working against you as a way to move forward with God. In fact, we as Christians who claim Jesus as our Savior believe that God became one of us so we could really see what this looks like. Last week we talked about the conversations Jesus had with the Pharisees about the Sabbath. Here's the part that didn't make the sermon. By the way, I always dreaded hearing my dad say, someone would come up to Dad at lunch and say, "Preacher, that was an excellent sermon," and that's when we got to hear all the stuff that didn't make the cut. Here's what I didn't talk about last week. Here's Jesus going from town to town, teaching, preaching, healing people, loving people, and he has this group of jerks following him around, nitpicking him to death, just trying to make his life miserable. Does that sound like a hero from a mythical story? Or does that sound like real life? I cannot tell you how many stories I have about people who for no good reason just tried to make my life miserable. How much time do we have this morning anyway? What time is it right now? Look at how Jesus dealt with his circumstances. He surrounded himself with a group of people that could help him step by step. He prepared them to continue what he was doing when he would no longer be with them in bodily form. And he taught them, and he teaches us to sail into the wind. And then what happened? Jesus is crucified. The disciples abandoned him. They thought they had been defeated. They literally just went back. Yes. And he couldn't wait for his salespeople to eventually ask him that question. What does that stand for? And he would always wait until they did. And then this is what he would say. You were at the training, right? I trained you what our system of sales looks like, right? You know that when you make money, I make money, right? He said the letters stand for don't mess with the system. He said salespeople in our company are always pulling me aside asking, what's the secret? Why would I withhold the secret from you? When you make money, I make money. Here's the system. Don't mess with the system. What is the secret to dealing with the problems that life inevitably brings, do you somehow think it is being withheld from you? There are all kinds of so-called religions that would tell you that it is being withheld from you. Give us some money. Take this course. Move up the ladder in our organizations and secrets will be made known to you. No, God has been trying to tell us the truth all along. It was lived out in the lives of people like Moses and Paul and Jesus, and it is given as a gift to us. We just have this tendency to mess with it and distort it into something that God never intended. One of the best gifts that God has given me is that I have met some of the finest Christians the world has ever known. My dad was one of them. He was the real deal. He had to deal with some extremely troubling circumstances in his life and in ministry. And as I study the Bible and study the lives of these incredible Christians that God has placed in my path, these are just a couple of things that I see. One is as simple as an openness. Not just open to people, open to what God might do in their lives. It is a way of looking back at your life and recognizing that God has been there all along, recognizing that God is here now, and being open to what God may do next in your life. That makes a difference in the new possibilities in your life. Some people read the Bible as God controlling each story. No, he does not. God leads people. God persuades people. God partners with people. But God doesn't make anybody do anything. God does not control us. Our lives are not controlled. The Bible does not depict life in anything but realistic terms. Our freedom is real. And at the same time, God has not wound up the world like a clock and let it go. God is active, and we are persuaded, but we are not forced. The best Christians I have known see life and their relationship with God this way. I said earlier, we're going to talk about some serious things this morning. If we're going to talk about the bad things that life inevitably brings, one of the oldest questions is why God allows them to happen. And first of all, I don't claim to have all the answers, and I'm not going to solve all of it this morning. But it's important to what we're talking about. I don't ever believe that God causes bad things to happen in our lives. Some people do. Some people are somehow comforted by that. Personally, I believe that is bad theology. Having said that, while I do not believe that bad things are God's intention, there is no escaping that they are at least permitted by God and that God allows it. One of the hardest lessons to learn in life is that even under the most difficult circumstances, God is still at work for good. The Bible says we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Those are some of the most beautiful words ever written. They can also be some of the most painful words ever written for someone who finds themselves at the bottom. There are those who embrace that truth, and there are those who reject it and continue a downward spiral in life. What does it look like to have the kind of faith that really believes that there is nothing that this life can bring that God cannot see them through? You know, we have these incredible stories of real life in the Bible. And then we also have the stories of the people that God places in our path. Many of you have heard me talk about my grandmother. She had a fourth grade education but had incredible faith. She was in a nursing home from the time I was in the second grade until she died in my freshman year in college, so I never got to have any conversations with her about her faith. She lost a child when she was 29, a 9-year-old son. If there were ever a reason to lose your faith, that is the reason. So I never got to ask her about it. It just so happens that in each of my 3 churches, the one in Atlanta, the one in Kentucky, and now this church, in each of those churches, I have had members that had to bury a child. And I listen to what those good Christian people have to say very carefully. I listen to them describe walking down that road, feeling the prayers of their church family, leaning on God in their darkest days. And they describe looking back, not understanding everything that happened fully, but understanding that God never abandoned them, and now they have the kind of strength to never lose hope. This morning, I'm going to end by reminding us not what happened at the end of Jesus' ministry, but by reminding us what happened at the beginning. What is the first thing that happened in the ministry of Jesus? It was not his first sermon or his first miracle. Jesus begins his ministry by going into the desert to fast for 40 days and be tempted by the devil. It is astounding to me that those temptations were not aimed at keeping Jesus from beginning his ministry. Read the story carefully. What Jesus was tempted to do was to proceed with his ministry without God, to separate the events of his life from God, for Jesus to forget where he came from and to face life relying upon someone or something other than God. The devil knew that if he could just get Jesus to rely on anything other than God, then Jesus would ultimately be overcome by what life had in store for him. And folks, I got to tell you, this is exactly the temptation that every one of us faces in life. It can take different forms, a million different forms, but the result is the same. If you somehow convince yourself that you are living apart from, separated from the one who created you, then the destination is one of isolation, exile. But if we really believe the stories of the lives of these people in the Bible, the lives of the good Christian people that God has placed in your path and my path, then we see God at work every step of the way. When life happens and brings us to our knees, the problem is not God's absence. The problem is that we fail to see God at work and the new possibilities that can come from it. But we have this treasure so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way but not crushed, struck down but not destroyed. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible. Dear God, let it be. For our moment of kindness this morning, as you exit, you're going to see a board with a bunch of numbers, money denominations on it. This is a fundraiser for our kids to go to Passport Camp. There's big numbers, medium numbers, and little numbers. It doesn't matter. Just take one of them with you. Come back next Sunday, make an additional donation so that we can make sure all of our kids can, that money will not be an issue that will keep any of our kids from going to Passport Camp this summer. Our final hymn is number 737, Like a River Glorious. What a perfect hymn to sing at a time like this. Will you stand? Will you sing? Will you respond? remain standing for just a moment? It has been such a good day. So glad to have each and every one of you here. So glad to have those of you who are worshiping with us online. If you felt God's presence this morning, I hope you'll tell somebody about it. I hope you'll invite them to come back with you and be a part of this family of faith. Why in the world would we keep this to ourselves? So will you join with me now in our open-eyed benediction? May the road rise to meet you. May the wind blow at your back. May the sun shine warmly on your face. May the rain fall softly on your field. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand.